Now, it is obviously 3 years since the start of the full scale invasion of Ukraine. Where are we now, in your opinion, in terms of who is the stronger party? Who's really in control here?
Well, the Americans are the strongest party, of course, and the fact that the United States has flipped, is flipping to re engage with Russia and Putin in a most dramatic and unilateral fashion, and is undermining President Zelensky's position. That's the big change. That is not only an existential problem for President Zelensky, who's been trying to maintain a fight against a much bigger Russia, but of course, it also is a huge question for the Europeans who recognize that they probably can't trust the Americans going forward the way they thought they could. And indeed, there's an open question as to whether NATO is going to be a going concern, which has been the most powerful, most important collective security agreement in the world for the past decades.
I want to come back to talk to you about the big week that's going to be in Washington, D.C. We know that both President Macron and Keir Starmer are heading over to talk to Donald Trump. But just focusing on President Zelensky for the moment, he appears to be suggesting that he would be willing to pay the price of removing himself from politics in Ukraine. A lot of the conversation last week was about installing a new leader. He seems to be holding his hands up and saying, I'm willing to go. What do you think is making him do that?
Well, I'm a little surprised you framed the question that way, in the sense that he said he would be willing to go if full NATO membership were to accrue to Ukraine, which of course is precisely what is absolutely not on the table now. I mean, Trump has made very clear that NATO is not happening, and the Americans clearly, as by far the most powerful country militarily in NATO, has the ability to unilaterally decide that. You'll note that Zelensky was not saying that a month ago, even a week ago, before Trump re engaged directly in Riyadh, his administration, with members of Putin's administration, and basically preemptively told the Russians that a concession of Ukraine not joining NATO ever would be on the table. So, I mean, on the one hand, it's virtue signaling. It doesn't mean anything. On the other hand, the fact that Trump has had the audacity to refer to Zelensky as a dictator because he isn't holding an election, which would be unconstitutional given the fact that a large piece of his territory is presently occupied, given the fact that the vast majority of the population in Ukraine don't think elections are appropriate right now, saying that Zelensky's approval is 4%, which is a Kremlin talking point. In reality, it's closer to 60, which is higher than Trump's. I mean, there's a lot of disinformation that has been coming from the US president in support of a policy that is meant to maximally pressure the weaker party,
Yeah.
Zelensky. And so Zelensky is reminding everyone that he's the one with legitimacy. He's reminding everyone that NATO invited him to join their alliance. The United States leading the way under President Bush and Vice President Cheney and Secretary of State Condi Rice. I mean, they're the ones that invited a democratically elected Ukraine to join. And now the Americans are unilaterally ripping that up. By the way, very similar to the Americans providing aid to Ukraine, not alone, aid. And now the Americans saying, actually, we want to get paid back for that
Yeah.
aid that we said we gave you, but actually isn't really aid. So, I mean, you can understand why the Europeans might question the durability of American credibility and commitment.
Yes, but I think my point more is, given everything that you've just said, why would Zelensky choose to say that now?
Because he reminds everyone, even though he's in a very weak position, that it is ultimately American commitment to rule of law that was supposed to be underpinning the global system, and that the Americans are unilaterally ripping up their own global order, their own commitments. That's why he's doing it. The United States was the country, along with yours, the UK, that signed the Budapest Memorandum. The Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons. The Americans were
Mm.
supposed to help ensure Ukrainian security. They weren't going to take advantage of Ukraine's economic position for their own national interest. Clearly, the Trump administration has no interest in that document that the Americans signed. So again, the idea, I think Zelensky is trying to remind the world that they have legitimacy. I think it's very interesting that Trump came out and said, look, Zelensky doesn't have any cards. And so I'm sick of listening to him. I'm sick of inviting him to the table. And what Zelensky is trying to remind everyone is that even though he personally has no power, he's in a very, very weak position, and he's got a smaller fighting force, and he relies on international aid. But the fact is, the vast majority of Americans don't trust Putin. A lot more trust Zelensky. Fact is, most Republicans in Trump's own party don't trust Putin. They trust Zelensky. The fact is that all the Europeans don't trust Putin. They trust Zelensky. So even though he doesn't have power, he does have leverage. His position has leverage. And it's very interesting that the deal that the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, brought to Kiev and said, you better sign this right now in this meeting, or there's going to be hell to pay. Well, he didn't sign it. And then Trump came back with an altered deal. I mean, if Zelensky doesn't have any influence, then why would Trump possibly be altering the terms of the deal? Is it because he's a nice guy? Nobody
Yeah.
believes that. So apparently, Zelensky does have, a couple of cards, even though they may not be up his sleeve, they matter. And he's
Yeah.
trying to
Let's
remind the
let's
world of that. That's what he's doing.
let's talk about Russia, because there's been a lot of conversation about how powerful Russia is in this environment. But actually, the reality, and it's something that Giorgia Meloni in Italy has picked up on and seems to be running with, is the idea that he's not an equal to Donald Trump. He is in a weak position. He's lost hundreds of thousands of healthy men. The economy is not in good shape. It's on a war footing that can't continue forever. It's going to be very painful domestically for Putin, and he needs this deal. I mean, what do you think is making Trump assume that Putin is on a par with him?
I don't think Trump assumes that Putin is on a par with him. I think he wants to end the war. He's made that a very, very clear electoral promise. And he knows that he only has so much leverage over Putin directly to end the war, because Putin's ability to take pain is far greater than Trump's. I mean, the United States is vastly more powerful than Russia on every front, on literally
So
every
why is
front.
Trump so why does Trump seem to be treating Putin in such a manner as to, I mean, he seems to be taking the Kremlin's talking points. He seems to be doing a lot of work to help those in Russia feel, that they are winning. I mean, there's jubilation. They are gleeful about what they're seeing. So why do that?
Well, Putin, of course, has no domestic constraints whatsoever. He doesn't have to worry about what his people have to say. So he can decide. It is in his capacity personally to decide whether or not they're going to stay on a war footing and continue to drive his economy into the dirt and make his people suffer, and hundreds of thousands of casualties and hundreds of thousands fleeing the country. And yet he can get away with that in a way that Trump can't. So if Trump really wants the war over and wants it over soon, he understands that he actually has to provide more to Putin, if that is his only interest and goal. But there's another point here as well, which is that the interest of the United States in undermining its core allies in Europe, because Trump doesn't want a strong European Union. He doesn't want Starmer or Macron or Merz, who's about to win in Germany. He wants the AfD. He wants the Reform Party in the UK. He wants the National Rally in France. He wants the end of the European Union. And he wants, sort of make America great again, America first acolytes across Europe. And one way to accomplish that is to undermine the collective position on Ukraine and on Russia, and to do a deal with Russia unilaterally in a way that those parties would support, but the mainstream parties, both center right and center left across Europe, would strongly oppose. That is part of what he is doing here. Because
Do you think he's
otherwise, why wouldn't you bring the Europeans in to have a collective, stronger position against the Russians? Right? I mean,
Yeah.
clearly, Biden did not end the war. Biden should have pushed the Ukrainians further and faster when they were in a stronger position to try to negotiate. He didn't do that. But what Biden did do was ensure that the collective negotiating position against Russia was in lockstep through 14 different sanctions that were put
Mm.
into place against the Russians by the Americans and the Europeans, with all of the weapon systems that were provided, all of the aid to Ukraine provided. That was done collectively. The first thing Trump did was say, "I'm going to work unilaterally. I don't need these allies." So that
Do you
does
think
undermine America's negotiating position, of course.
he gives Putin too much respect?
I don't think it's about respect. I don't think he respects any other foreign leader, particularly. I think he focuses on himself. I think he does believe that the law of the jungle is the most effective way for the Americans to get what they want. And in the nearest term, he may be right.
Yeah.
Because in a transactional world where you're dealing one on one with other actors, they have to basically kiss your ass or else. I mean, look, you just had Poland's president Duda show up and wait for an hour and a half in a hall outside for a meeting with President Trump that was supposed to be an hour, and he got like 7 minutes with him. And Trump doesn't care. Trump's view is this is the way I can treat these people. It's not about being an ally or about being an adversary. It's that they're going to do what I want. And that is, I think, just not the way that the United States has historically dealt with other countries.
Yeah.
And it
You don't think
undermines American power.
so you don't think there's anything personal here? Because Trump does seem to have something personal against President Zelensky. He seemed to be really spitting feathers in that message that he wrote, quite a long message, very unusual message on his social media last week. And there did seem to be a distinctly personal element to it.
I understand that, and there was a little bit of that with Trudeau as well. There definitely are people that Trump doesn't get on with, and he likes Modi more, for example, he likes Maloney more. So it's not just about authoritarians versus Democrats. I wouldn't say that. He likes Milei a lot, obviously, because they're ideologically aligned, and because he always says great things about Trump. Um, but in this case specifically, I think he was expecting Zelensky to accept his deal, which, because he's in such a strong position. And not only did Zelensky, I mean, a leader like King Abdullah in Jordan did not accept Trump's deal on Gaza, but he did show up and said all of these. He really abased himself in front of Trump. He talked about how brilliant he was, and he accepted 2,000 children that were sick from Gaza. And it was all very, yes, you're the guy. He kissed the ring. Zelensky didn't do that. I mean, Zelensky could have put together his own MOU and said, this is brilliant, and here's a deal that is really, shows Trump's, understanding of how to bring peace, and, this is really all about him. And instead, he said, this is a colonial deal.
Yeah.
We're not going to accept it. And Trump is in a disinformation bubble. And I mean,
So,
I am not at all surprised that Trump's reaction to that was exceptionally strong. And what's interesting, I was at the Munich Security Conference, and so I was like party to a lot of these conversations that the folks were having, the administration, the congressional delegation, and the rest. And it's very clear that Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, in their private conversations with the Americans, with the Germans, were saying something that was much more incremental and engaged with the Ukrainian position. And they were surprised with
but it
how
doesn't
much
matter, does
Trump
it? It
suddenly took a
doesn't.
whack.
But it doesn't matter because even if they're being more moderate and more diplomatic in their conversations behind closed doors, the
Yeah.
man who's in charge, their
No, no.
boss, is not. So it doesn't
No, my
matter in the
point
end.
is that they were surprised that Trump's position became so visceral
Mm,
against Ukraine. So I'm trying to help you answer, why is it? Is it something personal? I think the answer is yes. I think it was an immediate knee-jerk reaction to Zelensky offending Trump personally. How
yeah,
dare someone like Zelensky act like this? I think if King Abdullah had showed up to the White House and had said, "Are you kidding me? I can't do this. You're talking about ethnic cleansing of Palestinians." If he had done that, I think that Trump would have written an email exactly like what he wrote with Zelensky, and his own people would have been wrong-footed. So I
mm.
take your point completely, but I'm just trying to help you understand why he did that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just finally, I mean, obviously, given everything you've just said, it's an interesting time for both President Macron and Keir Starmer to be heading over to Washington this
yeah,
week.
yeah.
We understand that the British Prime Minister is hoping to act as a bridge and moderate, if you like, between the EU and America. How realistic do you think that is? And what approach do you think those two men should take? Because Starmer, up until now, has tried flattery. I'm not sure it's worked wholesale. What do you think is the best approach?
Clearly, right now is there's a crisis, and they're coming in with a very steep hill that they have to climb to get their position, to bridge their position and the American position, specifically on Ukraine. So what are they going to do? I mean, obviously you want to go in and you got to talk about, sort of how much you appreciate Trump being a peacemaker and all the rest, but you need the Europeans at the table. You need them to be coordinating with the Americans on what the outcome is going to be. And that you require leverage for that. Trump has been consistently critical of Europe's unwillingness to step up militarily. And so I think they need to bring a plan for that. Starmer's talked about, Macron has talked about troops on the ground. The Russians have said no troops would be acceptable from any NATO country. That has to be a non-starter for Starmer and Macron. And that can only be a non-starter if they have hard troop commitments from their countries and from others, the Baltics, the Nordics, for example, on the ground in Ukraine in the context of a ceasefire. They have to come to Trump with that, number one. Number two, something I would recommend, there's over $300 billion of Russian sovereign assets that have been frozen because of the illegal invasion of Ukraine. If I were Britain and France under this pressure, I would be supporting seizing those assets, which is close to, I mean, they're already using the guarantees of those assets to finance Ukrainian reconstruction. So they're already basically skirting the agreement. I would seize those assets and say, we're going to use those both for reconstruction and to buy American weapons to continue to defend Ukraine, because that's the kind of thing that's clearly going to appeal to Trump. And he can sell that as a huge win. This is going to be your plan, sir. You can announce it. You're going to look brilliant with your own people because you're going to be financing it. I mean, we're financing it. The Russians are financing it. You aren't. So if I think that they have to do that, but I will tell you that right now I am not optimistic that they're going to be successful at actually changing Trump's view, because the Europeans have been incremental. They are bureaucratic. They are slow moving, and they're under the gun both militarily and financially here. So it's. I mean, I'm very hopeful for them. I want them to succeed, but I would not bet a lot on it.
Finally, I have to ask you, the way that you talk about how the leaders, Macron and Starmer, should approach dealing with Trump, it is a bit like dealing with a child. It's reverse psychology. It's saying, this is your idea. You're going to love it. It's great. It's going to make you look brilliant. I mean, is that just the reality? Is that something that we have to price in now, that you cannot deal with Trump like you would deal with anyone else? And
Oh
is
no,
that
you
acceptable, I suppose?
absolutely can if you're more powerful than he is. I mean, I look at what Elon Musk can get away with in terms of his ability to stand up and sort of dominate the spotlight on a bunch of issues, and Trump sitting in the Oval Office and kind of beaming, and that's because Elon is vastly wealthier than Trump, and he also has a big piece of the global public square. He owns it. He controls it algorithmically. He's got the followers. I look at big funders of Donald Trump over the years who have a lot more money than him. And Trump's always been very good at managing those relations. Mohammed bin Salman is in a much better position to say, no, I'm not going to produce more oil. I don't care what you say, because, the fact is he's been incredibly useful to Trump, both politically and also personally, his family. And so, no, you can be transactional with Trump. You don't have to respond to him as a dangerous predator if you are powerful. But if you're weak, if you're Panama, if you're Denmark, right? If you're, Europe on security issues as opposed to on trade issues. On trade issues, it's transactional. On security issues, it's predatory behavior. And so that's the problem: is Trump is so much stronger in 2025 than he was in 2017, including being activated by Elon Musk, who really has not only a lot of power, but also incredible capability to implement, which should not be underestimated. Those things mean a lot more people have to behave towards Trump in the way that you are suggesting, Kate.
And where does the UK stand? You detailed the relationship between the EU, between other nations. How do you think Trump views the UK broadly?
Well, Trump loves Brexit. When he was president first time around and he'd meet with Macron at the beginning of those meetings, he'd always ask Macron, so when are you going to do like the Brits? Always. And, Macron would find a way to laugh it off. But he appreciates that because it puts him in a stronger position, both in terms of the UK's not having choices for alignment and also them being separated off. He'd like everybody else in Europe to do that.
So he sees us what, not as, are we a sort of transactional element for him, or are we never going to be as powerful, so we're always going to have to pander to him?
Yeah, I would say it's mostly the latter. And special relationship is very quaint historic term that perhaps people will write about in The Economist, but not something we can speak of at this point.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.